July 1944, a railroad platform in rural Minnesota. Dozens of townspeople gathered to witness the arrival of enemy prisoners, men they'd been taught to fear as monsters through years of wartime propaganda. But when a 2-year-old girl broke free from her mother's grip and ran toward the prisoners, what happened next shattered every expectation. In less than 60 seconds, a single embrace would force an entire community to confront an uncomfortable truth. The enemy had a human face. This is the story of how one child's innocence dismantled years of hatred, and why a photograph of that moment still challenges us today. Summer heat pressed down on the small railroad platform in Bird Island, Minnesota, as the distant whistle of an approaching train cut through the afternoon stillness. It was July 1944, and the war that had consumed the world for 5 years was reaching its terrible crescendo. American boys were dying on beaches in France, in jungles across the Pacific, in the skies over Germany, and now the war was coming home in a way this farming community of 1,200 souls had never imagined. They were bringing prisoners here, enemy soldiers, men who had fought against America, who had killed American boys, who represented everything the newsreels and propaganda posters had taught them to fear and hate. The announcement had rippled through Bird Island like a stone thrown into still water, creating circles of reaction that touched every family, every farm, every conversation at the general store and the church steps. On the platform that afternoon, dozens of townspeople had gathered. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see with their own eyes what an enemy soldier looked like. Others came out of duty, a grim-faced determination to witness the arrival of those who had brought so much suffering to the world. A few came out of fear, needing to know what kind of men would be working the fields alongside their own families, sleeping in barracks just miles from their homes. Among the crowd stood a young mother with her 2 daughters. Marlene, 8 years old, held tight to her mother's skirt, her eyes wide with the kind of nervous excitement that children feel when adults are tense and the air crackles with unspoken things. Beside her, barely reaching her mother's knee, stood 2-year-old Janice Sester, blonde curls catching the sunlight, her small hand clasped in her mother's palm. Janice understood nothing of war, nothing of enemies, nothing of the propaganda that had shaped every adult mind around her. She knew only that something important was happening, that a train was coming, and that crowds meant excitement. The war had created a strange new reality across America. While hundreds of thousands of American soldiers fought overseas, the country faced a critical labor shortage at home. Farms needed workers to harvest crops that would feed both civilians and troops. Factories needed hands to produce the endless supplies demanded by a global conflict. The solution, as strange as it seemed, was to bring enemy prisoners of war to American soil and put them to work. By the summer of 1944, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners were held in camps scattered across the United States. They came from North Africa, where Rommel's Africa Corps had finally been defeated after years of desert warfare. They came from Sicily and Italy, where Allied forces had pushed northward through brutal mountain campaigns. They were Germans, Italians, and a smaller number of Japanese, all transported thousands of miles from the battlefields where they had been captured, all finding themselves in a country that seemed impossibly wealthy, impossibly untouched by the destruction that had ravaged their homelands. The Italian prisoners were considered the least dangerous, the most cooperative. Italy had already surrendered in September 1943, switching sides and joining the Allies, though fighting continued in the northern part of the country. Many of the Italian POWs had been captured in North Africa, conscripted soldiers who had never wanted to fight in the first place, who had found themselves in a war they didn't understand, fighting for a fascist government many of them despised. But the people of Bird Island didn't know these nuances. What they knew came from the propaganda that had saturated American life since Pearl Harbor. They had seen the posters showing brutal caricatures of Axis soldiers, had watched newsreels depicting enemy troops as inhuman monsters, had absorbed the message that was necessary for any nation at war. The enemy is not like us. The enemy is other. The enemy is less than human. This dehumanization was not accidental. It was carefully constructed, psychologically necessary. How else could you ask young men to kill other young men? How else could you sustain a nation's will to fight through years of casualties and sacrifice? You had to create distance, had to transform the enemy from someone's son or father or brother into something abstract, something monstrous, something that could be destroyed without moral anguish. And so the crowd that gathered on the Bird Island platform that July afternoon expected to see monsters. They expected to see the faces from the propaganda posters, the cruel eyes and twisted expressions that confirmed everything they had been told. They expected to feel their hatred justified, their fear validated. The train appeared first as a dark shape in the distance, growing larger as it approached, its whistle growing louder. The crowd pressed forward, then stepped back as guards moved into position. These were American military police, armed and serious, their presence a reminder that despite the mundane setting of a small-town railroad platform, this was still war. These were still enemy combatants, and protocols had to be followed. The train slowed, brakes squealing against metal, steam hissing from beneath the carriages. Through the windows, shadowy figures could be seen moving. The crowd fell silent, that peculiar hush that comes over people when anticipation reaches its peak and reality is about to intrude. The doors opened. The first prisoners descended, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the watching townspeople. These were not the monsters from the posters. These were thin young men in worn uniforms, their faces gaunt and exhausted, their movements slow with the weariness of a long journey. They looked defeated, yes, but more than that, they looked human. Uncomfortably, undeniably human. One prisoner in particular caught the eye, though at the time no one could have known he would become the center of a moment that would echo through decades. He was perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, though hardship had aged him in ways that made precise age difficult to determine. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had clearly once carried more weight. His eyes, dark and distant, seemed to look at nothing in particular, the gaze of someone who had learned to retreat inside himself as a survival mechanism. As he stepped down from the train, his legs unsteady after hours of confinement, he moved mechanically, following the prisoner in front of him, obeying the shouted commands of the guards without really hearing them. His mind was elsewhere, as it often was during these moments of transition. He was thinking of home, of a small village in northern Italy that might or might not still exist, that might or might not have been destroyed in the fighting that had consumed his country. He was thinking of his wife, of whether she was still alive, of whether she had received any of the letters he had been allowed to send through the Red Cross. Most of all, he was thinking of his children, 2 small daughters he had not seen in more than 2 years, whose faces he conjured in his mind every night before sleep, terrified that he might forget the exact curve of their cheeks, the precise sound of their laughter. The crowd watched in silence as the prisoners formed a ragged line under the guards' direction. Some of the townspeople's faces showed confusion, a cognitive dissonance between what they had expected and what they were seeing. Others maintained their hard expressions, determined not to be swayed by appearances, reminding themselves that these men had fought for evil regimes, that American boys had died because of them. Marlene Sester, standing beside her mother, would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Years later, as an elderly woman, she would describe the strange tension on that platform, the way the adults around her seemed both frightened and disappointed, as if they had been prepared for something terrible and instead found something they didn't know how to process. And then Janice ran. It happened so quickly that no one could have prevented it. Her mother had turned slightly, distracted for just a moment by a neighbor's comment, and in that instant, Janice's small hand slipped free. The little girl, seeing the line of men and responding to some impulse that existed entirely outside the adult world of war and propaganda and fear, simply ran toward them. Her small feet carried her across the wooden platform, her blonde curls bouncing, her face lit with the uncomplicated joy of a toddler who has escaped supervision and is having an adventure. The crowd gasped. Her mother cried out. The guards tensed, hands moving toward weapons, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented breach of protocol. The Italian prisoner saw her coming. For a moment, his exhausted mind couldn't process what he was seeing. A small child, no more than 2 or 3 years old, running directly toward him with arms outstretched. And then, in a flash of recognition that pierced through all his carefully constructed emotional armor, he saw his own daughter. Not literally, of course. This child was blonde where his daughters were dark-haired, American where his were Italian. But the age was right, The size was right, and the gesture, arms reaching up, the universal signal of a small child who wants to be held, was precisely what his own daughter had done 1,000 times before the war had taken him away. Janice reached him, and without hesitation wrapped her small arms around his leg, hugging him with the fierce, unself-conscious affection that only very young children possess. She looked up at him and smiled. The prisoner stood frozen for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats. Around him the world had stopped. The guards had halted mid-motion. The crowd held its collective breath. Even the other prisoners had turned to watch, their own faces registering shock and something else, something that looked like pain. And then, moving with a gentleness that seemed impossible in a man who had spent years in the brutality of war, the prisoner bent down and lifted Janice into his arms. He held her the way fathers hold their children, one arm supporting her weight, the other hand cradling her back. He looked at her face so close to his own, and something inside him that had been locked away for survival, for sanity, for the ability to endure another day in captivity, simply broke open. He began to cry, not quiet tears, but deep, shaking sobs that came from a place of profound loss and unexpected grace. His shoulders trembled, his face contorted with the effort of emotions too large to contain. And through it all, he held Janice carefully, protectively, as if she were made of glass, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Janice, unbothered by his tears, patted his cheek with her small hand. She smiled at him again, that radiant, trusting smile that children give to the world before they learn to be afraid. She had no concept that this man was supposed to be her enemy, that he represented a nation at war with her own, that the adults around her had been taught to hate and fear him. She saw only a person, a sad person who needed comfort, and she offered it with the pure, uncomplicated generosity of innocence. The crowd on the platform stood transfixed. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in the air, in the collective consciousness of everyone watching. The propaganda that had shaped their expectations, the carefully constructed narrative of the inhuman enemy, simply evaporated in the face of this undeniable reality. A man holding a child and weeping with the grief of a father separated from his own children. Individual reactions rippled through the crowd. A farmer in his 50s who had 2 sons fighting in Europe felt his throat tighten as he recognized in the prisoner's face the same anguish he himself felt every night, wondering if his boys were safe. A young mother, clutching her own infant, saw not an enemy soldier but a father's love, universal and unmistakable. An elderly woman, who had lost her husband in the First World War and had spent this war consumed with bitterness toward all things German and Italian, felt something crack in her chest, a hardness she had carried for so long that she had forgotten it was there. The guards, trained to maintain order and protocol, found themselves uncertain. This situation was not covered in their manuals. A prisoner was holding an American child, but there was clearly no threat, no danger, only a moment of such raw humanity that intervening felt somehow obscene. They looked at each other, at their commanding officer, waiting for direction that didn't come. The officer, a career military man who had seen combat in the First World War, simply watched, his own face unreadable, but his hands remaining at his sides, his weapon holstered. Marlene, standing beside her mother, would later recall that she saw people's faces change. She was too young to articulate exactly what she was witnessing, but she understood that something important was happening, that the adults around her were experiencing something that confused and moved them. She saw women wiping their eyes. She saw men looking away, then looking back, unable to stop watching. She saw the rigid postures of anger and fear soften into something more complicated, more human. The prisoner whispered something in Italian, words that most of the crowd couldn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable in his tone. "Mia figlia," he said, his voice breaking. "My daughter." He said other things too, a stream of Italian that might have been prayer or memory, or simply the release of everything he had held inside for so long. He pressed his cheek against Janice's hair, breathing in the scent of childhood, of innocence, of everything he had lost and might never have again. Time seemed suspended. In reality, the moment probably lasted no more than a minute or 2, but for everyone present, it stretched into something longer, something that felt outside the normal flow of time. It was a moment of collective recognition, of seeing past the labels and uniforms and propaganda to the fundamental truth underneath. We are all human. We all love. We all suffer. We all long for home and family and peace. Finally, gently, Janice's mother approached. She moved slowly, carefully, her own face wet with tears. She had been terrified when Janice ran. But now, seeing her daughter safe in the arms of a man who clearly meant her no harm, she felt something else entirely. She felt ashamed of her fear, grateful for this stranger's gentleness and overwhelmed by the realization of what her daughter's innocent gesture had revealed. She reached out, and the prisoner, understanding, carefully transferred Janice back to her mother's arms. He looked at the woman, and she looked back at him, and in that exchange of glances was an entire conversation that needed no words. Thank you for not harming her. Thank you for letting her comfort me. I'm sorry for what you've lost. I'm sorry for what we've all lost. I hope you find your children again. I hope this war ends soon. The prisoner stepped back into line, wiping his face with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself. The other prisoners around him looked at him with understanding, several of them also wiping their eyes. They all carried the same burden of separation, the same grief of not knowing if their families were safe, the same desperate hope that someday they would return home. The guards, after a moment's hesitation, resumed their duties. Commands were given and the prisoners began moving toward the waiting trucks that would transport them to the work camp. But the atmosphere had changed. The rigid military precision had softened slightly. One guard, a young man barely out of his teens, offered a canteen of water to a prisoner who looked particularly exhausted. Another guard, older and harder-faced, found himself unable to bark orders with his usual harshness. As the prisoners walked past the crowd toward the trucks, something remarkable happened. Some of the townspeople, almost unconsciously, raised their hands in small waves. Not celebratory, not friendly exactly, but acknowledging, seeing. A few nodded. One woman, overcome with emotion, called out, "God bless you," before covering her mouth, shocked at her own words. The prisoner who had held Janice turned back once before climbing into the truck. He scanned the crowd until he found her, still in her mother's arms. Janice, seeing him look, waved her small hand. He raised his own hand in return, a gesture of farewell that carried the weight of everything that had passed between them, everything that had been revealed in those few extraordinary moments. Then the trucks pulled away, carrying the prisoners to the camp where they would spend the coming months working in the fields and factories of Minnesota, and the crowd on the platform slowly dispersed, each person carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed, each person changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. Janice's mother, her hand still trembling slightly, pulled out the small camera she had brought to document this historic day. She had taken several photographs during the arrival of the prisoners, but the most important one had been captured almost by instinct, in the moment when the Italian soldier had lifted Janice into his arms. She had raised the camera and clicked the shutter, preserving forever the image of a little blonde girl in the arms of a weeping enemy soldier, a moment of pure humanity in the midst of the world's greatest war. In the days and weeks that followed, the prisoners of war began their work on the farms surrounding Bird Island. The initial tensions that might have been expected, the fear, the hostility, the suspicion, were notably muted. The memory of that moment on the platform had spread through the community like ripples in water, touching conversations at dinner tables and church gatherings, softening the hard edges of hatred that propaganda had worked so hard to create. Farmers who had expected to treat the prisoners as dangerous enemies found themselves instead sharing meals with them, offering shade during the hottest parts of the day, attempting communication across language barriers through gestures and smiles, and the universal language of shared work. The prisoners, surprised by this treatment, responded with gratitude and diligence. They worked hard, not just because they were required to, but because they were being treated with a basic human dignity they had not expected to find in enemy territory. The photograph that Janice's mother had taken began to circulate through the town, passed from hand to hand, studied and discussed. People saw in it different things, but all saw the same fundamental truth. The man in that picture was not a monster. He was a father, separated from his children, finding a moment of connection with a child who saw him not as an enemy, but simply as a person. This was happening not just in Bird Island, but across America. The POW program, which had begun as a pragmatic solution to labor shortages, was inadvertently creating thousands of small moments of human connection. Italian prisoners in particular were often treated with surprising kindness. Many were allowed to attend local churches, to participate in community events, to form friendships with the Americans they worked alongside. Some would later say that their time as prisoners in America was better than their lives had been in fascist Italy, that they had been treated with more dignity as captives than as citizens of their own country. This reality created a strange and uncomfortable irony. While Italian POWs were often welcomed into white American communities, Black American soldiers returning from the war faced segregation, discrimination, and violence. The same farmers who shared meals with Italian prisoners would not have allowed Black Americans to eat at their tables. The same towns that softened toward enemy soldiers maintained rigid color lines that denied basic humanity to their own citizens. This contradiction revealed the arbitrary and constructed nature of prejudice, the way that hatred and acceptance could be turned on and off based on factors that had nothing to do with actual human worth. But in that moment on the platform in Bird Island, none of these larger contradictions were visible. What was visible was simpler and more immediate. A child's embrace had revealed the humanity of a man who was supposed to be inhuman, and in doing so had challenged everyone watching to reconsider what they thought they knew about enemies and war and the nature of the other. The Italian prisoner whose name no one recorded, whose identity was lost to history, eventually returned to Italy when the war ended. Whether he found his family alive, whether he was reunited with the daughters he had thought of every day of his captivity, whether he ever knew that his moment of grief and grace had been photographed and remembered, these things are unknown. He disappeared back into the vast anonymity of history, one of millions of soldiers who fought and suffered and survived, carrying their own private stories that would never be fully told. But the moment itself survived. Marlene's sister, who had been 8 years old on that platform, carried the memory through her entire life. Decades later, as an elderly woman, she would give testimony about what she had witnessed, describing in vivid detail the transformation she had seen in the faces of the adults around her, the way a single gesture of innocent affection had shattered years of carefully constructed hatred. Janice herself, too young to remember the event, grew up knowing the story, seeing the photograph, understanding that she had been part of something significant, even if she had no conscious memory of it. The photograph became a family treasure, a piece of history that connected them to something larger than themselves. Eventually, the photograph found its way to a museum in Minnesota, where it became part of an exhibit on World War II and the POW camps that had dotted the American landscape. Museum visitors would stop before the image, studying the face of the weeping soldier, the trusting smile of the little girl, trying to imagine the moment, trying to understand what it meant. What it meant ultimately was this: propaganda is powerful, but it is also fragile. It can shape minds and mobilize nations, but it cannot withstand the direct experience of human connection. You can tell people that the enemy is a monster. You can show them posters and newsreels that reinforce this message. You can create an entire narrative structure that dehumanizes the other. But all of this can be undone in an instant by a single authentic encounter with another person's humanity. War requires dehumanization. This is not a moral judgment, but a psychological reality. Soldiers cannot kill people they see as fundamentally like themselves, as someone's beloved child or parent or sibling. The machinery of war depends on creating distance, on transforming the enemy from a person into a target, from a human being into an abstraction that can be destroyed without unbearable moral anguish. Propaganda serves this purpose. It creates the psychological distance necessary for killing. It tells soldiers and civilians alike that the enemy is different, is other, is less than fully human. And for the most part, it works. People believe what they are told, especially when the message is repeated constantly, when it comes from authority figures, when it is reinforced by the trauma and fear of wartime. But propaganda has a weakness. It cannot survive direct human contact. When you actually meet the person you have been taught to hate, When you look into their eyes and see your own humanity reflected back, the narrative collapses. This is why segregation required physical separation, why apartheid required pass laws and separate facilities, why genocide requires ghettos and camps. Dehumanization cannot be maintained when people actually know each other, when they share meals and conversations and moments of vulnerability. Janice Sester, at 2 years old, had no propaganda in her head. She had not yet learned to categorize people into us and them, friend and enemy, safe and dangerous. She saw a person, and she responded with affection, and in doing so, she gave everyone watching permission to see what she saw. Not a monster, but a man. Not an abstraction, but a father. Not an enemy, but a human being in pain. The crowd on that platform had come expecting to have their prejudices confirmed. They had come to see monsters, and instead they saw themselves. They saw their own grief at separation from loved ones, their own fear for their children's safety, their own longing for the war to end and normal life to resume. They saw, in the face of an enemy soldier, a mirror of their own humanity. This recognition was uncomfortable. It created cognitive dissonance, a clash between what they had been taught to believe and what they were directly experiencing. Some people no doubt resisted this recognition, retreating back into the safety of propaganda and prejudice, but others allowed themselves to be changed by it, to let this moment of truth reshape their understanding of who the enemy really was. The photograph captured this moment, but it could not capture everything. It could not capture the silence that fell over the crowd, the collective intake of breath, the sense of time stopping. It could not capture the individual transformations happening in dozens of hearts and minds, the softening of hatred, the emergence of empathy. It could not capture the way this moment would ripple outward, affecting how the townspeople treated the prisoners in the months to come, how they would tell this story to their children and grandchildren, how they would carry it as a reminder that things are not always what we are told they are. What the photograph did capture was the essential truth: a man holding a child, weeping, and in that simple image, the whole edifice of wartime propaganda revealed as the construction it was. Not false exactly. The war was real, the suffering was real, the reasons for fighting were real, but incomplete. Missing the full picture of human complexity, of the fact that people on all sides of a conflict are still people, still capable of love and grief and tenderness, still deserving of basic recognition of their humanity. This is not to say that all wars are unjust, or that all enemies are simply misunderstood friends. World War II was a necessary war, fought against genuinely evil regimes that had to be stopped. The Italian soldier on that platform had fought for Mussolini's fascist government, had been part of a military machine that had invaded other countries and committed atrocities. These facts do not disappear in the face of his tears, but neither do his tears disappear in the face of these facts. He could be both, a soldier who had fought for an evil cause, and a father who loved his children and wept at the memory of them. He could be both enemy and human. These things were not contradictory, though propaganda would have us believe they were. This is the lesson that Janice's embrace taught, the truth that the photograph preserved. We are all more than the worst things we have done, more than the causes we have served, more than the uniforms we have worn. We are all someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved. We all know grief and love and fear and hope. We are all, fundamentally, human. In our own time, this lesson remains urgent. We still create propaganda, still dehumanize those we disagree with or fear, still construct narratives that allow us to dismiss entire groups of people as other, as less than, as unworthy of empathy. We do this with immigrants and refugees, with people of different religions or political beliefs, with anyone who falls outside our definition of us. And we do this, in part, because it is easier. It is easier to hate abstractions than people. It is easier to fear categories than individuals. It is easier to maintain our prejudices when we never have to actually encounter the humanity of those we have been taught to despise. But moments like the one on that platform in Bird Island remind us that this ease comes at a cost. The cost is our own humanity, our own capacity for empathy and connection, our own ability to see the world as it actually is rather than as propaganda tells us it is. Janice Sester, in her innocence, gave a gift to everyone on that platform. She gave them the opportunity to see truly, to recognize the humanity of someone they had been taught to hate, to feel empathy for someone they had been told was their enemy. Some accepted this gift, and some did not, but it was offered, freely and without agenda, by a child who knew nothing of war or propaganda or the complicated politics of hatred. The photograph of that moment sits in a museum now, a piece of history, a reminder of a time when the world was at war, and a little girl's embrace revealed a truth that propaganda could not erase. Visitors stop and look at it, and some are moved, and some are not, and some see in it only a historical curiosity, a footnote to the larger story of World War II. But for those who look closely, who allow themselves to really see what the photograph shows, it offers something more, a challenge and an invitation. The challenge is to recognize how we dehumanize others in our own lives, how we allow propaganda and prejudice to shape our perceptions, how we maintain psychological distance from those we have been taught to fear or hate. The invitation is to choose differently, to see as Janice saw, with eyes unclouded by ideology or fear, to recognize the humanity in everyone we meet, even, especially, those we have been told are our enemies. This is not easy. It requires us to question narratives we have accepted, to challenge our own prejudices, to sit with the discomfort of recognizing that people we have dismissed as other are actually, uncomfortably, like us. It requires us to hold complexity, to understand that people can be both perpetrators and victims, both wrong and human, both enemy and worthy of basic dignity. But if a 2-year-old child could do it, if she could run across a platform and embrace a stranger without fear or hatred, if she could see a person where adults saw only an enemy, then perhaps we can too. Perhaps we can choose, in our own lives and our own time, to see as she saw. Perhaps we can allow moments of authentic human connection to shatter the propaganda that tells us who to hate and who to fear. The Italian soldier whose name we do not know, who wept on a platform in Minnesota in the summer of 1944, has been dead for many years now. Janice Sester, the little girl who embraced him, has lived her life and grown old. Marlene Sester, who witnessed the moment, has told her story and passed into history. The townspeople who stood on that platform, who felt their prejudices challenged and their hearts moved, have all gone. But the moment remains. The photograph remains. The truth it reveals remains. And the choice it presents, to see humanity or to see only enemy, to choose empathy or to choose hatred, to allow our prejudices to be challenged or to cling to them despite evidence to the contrary. This choice remains as well, offered to each of us, every day, in every encounter with someone we have been taught to see as other. On a summer day in 1944, a little girl ran across a platform and hugged a man she was supposed to fear, and for just a moment, everyone watching saw the truth. We are all human, we all suffer, we all love, and no amount of propaganda can erase this fundamental reality. It is a lesson worth remembering, worth preserving, worth passing on to future generations who will face their own versions of the same choice. In the end, that is what the photograph in the Minnesota Museum really shows. Not just a historical moment, but a timeless truth. Not just a little girl and a soldier, but all of us, reflected in their embrace, challenged by their example, invited to see as clearly as a child sees, before the world teaches us to hate.